welcome you all. We are in the middle of our annual Research Ethics Week, and the theme of Ethics Week this year is what makes your research trustworthy, threats and opportunities. And the goal of this week is to promote and ensure trustworthiness in our scientific and research endeavors. How can we optimize and signal the trustworthiness of research to maintain the trust of colleagues, participants, those who apply our research, and the wider public? Before we delve into today's session, I do want to make a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important that we acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We acknowledge our words are not enough. We need to ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. With that, I'm pleased to open our session today, which is entitled Best Practices for Indigenous Research, Policy Development and Implementation. And I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors of this event from the School of Public Health, College of Liberal Arts, and the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I also want to put a shout out to Sarah Veblen Mortensen from our School of Public Health, a Director of Research Initiatives, who really was a key point person in putting together today's webinar. I'm from the School of Public Health. I'm the Associate Dean for Research, and my name is Marizin Ramirez. I'm a professor in Environmental Health Sciences. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Senior Advisor Karen Diver. Karen Diver is currently serving as the inaugural Senior Advisor to the President for Native American Affairs at the University of Minnesota. In addition to her previous roles in higher education, Karen was also an appointee of President Obama as the Special Assistant to the President for Native American Affairs as part of the Domestic Policy Council from November 2015 until the end of President Obama's administration. Karen served as the chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa from 2007 to 2015. She has a bachelor's in economics from the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Today's seminar will highlight the work being done at the University of Minnesota to provide new guidelines and policy in conducting research with Indigenous communities, with a special focus on ethics that inform this work. I also want to introduce our facilitator and moderator for today's session, Professor Vicente Diaz. Professor Diaz is the chair of the American Indian Studies Department at the University of Minnesota. He's also the founder and director of the Native Canoe Program, which uses traditional Indigenous watercraft and Indigenous water-based ecological knowledge and technology to advance community-engaged research, teaching, and service. He is also the leader of the University of Minnesota Summer Institute for Global Indigeneity, which offers graduate student training on the promise of Indigenous studies, particularly focused on the native Great Lakes, Mississippi River region. With that, I would like Professor Diaz to say a few words before Karen Diver begins her talk today. Professor Diaz?
You're muted, Vince.
Kasalelia, Marisan, and good morning, everybody. It's so good to see such a huge turnout for one of the most important themes in research, but also in ethics generally. The question of doing good research with Indigenous communities. There's just really two main points I wanted to make, and then open it up back to Karen. The first is all of us know that Indigenous people have gotten a bum deal over the last 500 years, and that's putting it mildly. What most people don't realize is that what's been particularly important in that lousy relationship is can be linked to how natives are not only treated, but how they're treated in reference to um, the knowledge systems that we have. Uh, Indigenous people have been observing the world around us for thousands and thousands of years in methodical, systematic, innovative, experimental ways. But that has never been accorded its recognition. Instead, we've been seen as primitive, as in our knowledge systems as mythic or mythological, or the stuff of legends and voodoo and stuff like this. It's also, at the same time, we have not appreciated enough the extent to which enlightenment-based science has also actually borrowed heavily from indigenous knowledge. And so you have part of this history of violence has included not just denigration, but also appropriation and usurpation of knowledge without the adequate acknowledgement. The second point that I wanted to make is that doing, as I'm sure you're going to see, the need to do research with indigenous peoples differently, to be in good relations with them, to not continue to be complicit in a history of violent erasure and elimination that surely is a big part of the question of ethics and research. That in addition to that, and probably beyond that, we need to understand that how being in good relations with Native people, because of the way that our knowledge systems seek to be in good relations with the world around us, is also itself a really crucial ingredient for doing good research generally. So being in good relations with natives and being a good relative is a precondition for being a good scholar, and not just for social relations. But social relations is absolutely necessary for being good scholar. So I just wanted to foreground these points and look forward to questions and comments you'll have at the end. For now, I turn it over to Karen Diver. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and Professor Diaz for assisting us here today. Bujuanin, Karen Diver, Nindigenous Zaganashi Mung, Makwanindo Dem, Nagachi Wanang Nindujaba. Karen Diver, I'm a citizen of the Fond du Lac Banna Lake Superior, Chippewa. And in my role as senior advisor, we've had complaints, and I had them when I was a tribal leader within my own community about how we interact with institutions of higher education. So we convened a group of about 25 people and started working on some guidelines. But I'd like to talk about some kind of balcony level principles that were used in developing these guidelines. And then I'd like to show you a bit about it. We are currently undertaking university-wide consultation on the guidelines. So if you have not seen them yet, you will see them shortly, because we're actually consulting so that these can be official university policy. But at this point, I am going to share my screen. I think I'm going to share my screen. Let's try that one more time. There we go. All right. The one thing I super hate about Zoom is that all of your stuff gets covered up by Zoom, all of the Zoom stuff. How's that? Is that good? Yay, I did it. So, whoops, no, I didn't. As I was saying, there's a group of about 25 academics, researchers, some of our research centers that have been involved in all of this. We're also consulting with tribes on all of this. So we will have really robust interactions about what does this all mean, okay? So one of the issues, and Dr. Diaz spoke about this, is we've just been really terrible in the academy about how we interact with tribes. One of the most heinous ones lately is one of the researchers who, under the guise of academic freedom, still is holding on to ancestors within an institution. And the institution had to intervene because of the objection of tribes. And of course, this is against the law, right? The Native American Graves Repatriation Act says that these ancestors have to be returned back home. But you know, it was looked at as purely research and from an academic fashion without any regard whatsoever that these are relations. And we wouldn't expect to allow, you know, people to go dig up Western grave sites and dig up your grandma. But for some reason, the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples where it became acceptable as a research practice. No, we don't line them up and put gravestones in them, nor are we required to have our dead be respected and our ancestors not be disturbed. But this academic has kind of doubled down on it. There's been extraction of DNA, and we know about the All of Us study and trying to get a huge repository of DNA. And we've seen institutions that have tried to bypass tribal consent by working with urban Indian populations, which blew up spectacularly for that institution as unethical for the lack of engagement. And then, of course, we have our own examples here at the University of Minnesota with the Mimbres collection, which we are finally in compliance with the law now and working with tribes on returning those ancestors and funerary objects back home. So a few examples, but there are thousands, right, of examples of lack of tribal consultation and erasure of Indigenous folks and kind of reducing us to subjects rather than fellow human beings. In case you're not aware, there are 11 tribal nations in Minnesota, 7 Anishinaabe, 6 of which comprise the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, with Red Lake standing on its own, and then the 4 Dakota tribes. There are 574 tribes at this time in the United States, plus Native Hawaiians. There could be more, but due to various federal Indian policies, recognition of their tribal status and their governmental status was stripped from them by Congress during a period of what they called termination. These considerations that we're talking about today also apply in international contexts, whether you're wherever your work is, if it's with Indigenous peoples of those lands. They may have treaties, they may have other arrangements with their governments, but regardless, they were peoples and self-governed long before they were colonized, and these principles would apply to them as well. You can use as guidance the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The UN Declaration is generally for government's use, but we are kind of an institution like a government in terms of our policy and our kind of the way we, our power, right? Our power in community. And so one of the main parts of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is free, prior, and informed consent. We talk about trustworthiness in our relationships. There is nothing that builds trust more than communication and consent, that those folks are actually consenting to. All right. And then one of the main takeaways I'd like for you to have is that, you know, in a lot of diversity and equity work, people sometimes ask me, you know, what makes Native folks different? Why do they get an advisor, senior advisor to the president? Why did President Obama have a special assistant for Native American affairs? The equities are slightly different for Indigenous communities because they are governments. It's not just a racial group, not just culture. It's not just differing traditions. It is the fact that through treaty making, we recognize that the United States made agreements with other sovereigns, and only sovereigns under international law can make treaties with other sovereigns. And Supreme Court cases through the years, as well as lawmaking, there's this duty of care that comes to tribal nations because of those treaties and recognition that they are sovereigns. And they exercise home rule and self-determination through lawmaking, ordinances, etc. And that they have jurisdiction over their lands and their peoples. That is just a fact, not subject to negotiation. It sounded a little like a tribal leader there for a while, but you know, as Indigenous people, we need to assert those rights because they've been undermined pretty consistently for over 500 years, right? And so now tribes are stronger and they are building their capacity and they are asserting their jurisdiction. So, you know, a lot of this has come about because, you know, as Professor Diaz has said, research was done to tribes or on tribes and not with tribes through the years. A lot of it was driven by the people doing the research and their particular fields of study and their particular interests. Not to put too fine a point on it, upon occasion they're included because we think it'll give us extra points on a grant application because we're using a minoritized communities or an underserved communities. But it isn't necessarily something that the tribes need themselves in their own self-governing capacity, or is it something that's desired? And so we'll talk a little bit more about how to manage that. I get emails at least once a week in terms of, you know, can you help me make a relationship with the tribe? I have a grant due next week. And the answer to that is always no. No, I can't help you with that. Because what is ethical and what is right is that you have an ongoing interest in assisting that tribe in their research needs, and you have a prior relationship where you have taken the time to build that trust, that they know who you are, the work that you do. You've come to some agreement about what is important to the tribe. It is value add back to them or mutually beneficial. That you've decided up front, how do you resolve conflict and who are you accountable to? We have some real best practices within the University of Minnesota where they have agreements, you know, up front that talk about, you know, how do they research, how do they resolve sticky questions? They have an advisory board or a technical working group or something similar like that, where they have that touchstone to continue to go back to, where the tribe can bring up concerns that might not have been you know, thought of when the relationship was first starting to be formed. And so they can go to that and kind of work it out on the ground. But first and foremost, that you have permission. So how do you get that permission? People say, you know, can I just call up tribal leaders? No, you can't. They run nations. Best practices, you find the person who is similar to the field you're researching in. If you're a public health official, guess what? Tribes have public health officials. They have clinics. You go to the people who would be your peer in your field in the tribe and talk to them what it is you're doing or seeking to do, or what you can offer, best case scenario. That there's this field that you would like to, this certain area you would like to research. Is that something that they need? Are there gaps in their own knowledge systems that they need to grow their programs or expand or understand about their citizens? Is that something that you can help with? And once again, the stupid bar is in my way. And then another part of it is, what have you done to prepare yourself for work with the tribe? Before you pick up that phone, what do you know about them? Have you educated yourself about the norms in that community, its governing structure? Have you, do you understand how to be culturally competent in that space? And so, some of you might say, well, how do I figure that out? And one of the examples I use, and probably many of you on this training today, you have visited a foreign country, right? Mexico, somewhere with a fairly, distinct cultural set of cultural norms and language. And so much like we don't want to be that American that everybody recognizes that travels, how we have the bad rep when we travel because, we don't try to fit in. Your best travel experiences come about when you learn a few phrases that are how to say thank you, how to say good morning. You understand the laws of that country because you don't go to another country and, not to use not, I'm kind of trying to be funny, but maybe not funny, but locked up abroad, right? Like you would learn, don't spit gum out in Singapore because that's bad, right? And has very harsh sanctions. You try to be knowledgeable about the place you're visiting. Same with tribal nations. Now, you're thinking, where do I start? We have a couple things in the works that are going to help you. We're working on a LibGuide because we know higher ed loves their LibGuides, but we're also going to have a 3-part training available through the Office of Equity and Diversity, 3-module training that will be rolled out later this semester. So there are just best practices. It really is, some of this is a little bit repetitive, but it's worth it to hear it and really let it kind of soak in. The relationship comes first, before grant applications, before research, that you get tribal consent at each stage. Before, during, after, you set up the mechanism to have that ongoing relationship and conversation so that nothing goes astray, that there isn't any misunderstandings or assumptions that we make as an institution that weren't clear to our partner on the ground. That you respect tribal data sovereignty and you have those conversations up front. They should own the rights to their data. And you're saying, well, you know what, my funder requires that open data. And we know that's big at the feds right now, right? Tribes are having conversations with their federal partners and saying, we don't give consent for you, federal government, to ignore our rights to control our own data. So those are all things that are working, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't behave ethically now. So one of the things I did as a tribal leader where we were doing some homelessness surveys is we agreed to let the information be out there in an aggregate form, but disaggregated data that was particular to only our reservation was owned by the tribe where we could use it for our own planning purposes to inform how we grew our services and what the gaps were. Because the usefulness to the general public was actually in the aggregated data. And so we made all of those decisions up front before the survey was done. Right now, traditional ecological knowledge and tribal traditional knowledge is something very desired by the Academy. Professor Diaz mentioned that. That scares the heck out of Indigenous folks because a large part of what we do as a higher education institution is we like our trademarks, we like our new businesses we launch, right? We tend to do things because it benefits us as an institution, and with tribes, they very much know that they have knowledge systems that haven't been tapped and equipped, and that they've been using for millennia. There is potential and possibility. And the reality is Western-based education has gaps in these other ways of knowing. We also know that over time, we've been very adaptable as Indigenous folks and have watched what has happened, whether it's our terrestrial landscape, our knowledge systems and how we use science and astrology and our governance systems and all of these things. There is something to be said in respectful relationships to find out how this rising tide of partnership can really lift all boats. But when you do the data sovereignty and the tribal consent, tribes then can say what is for public knowledge and what is not. We see this with the Cloquet Forestry Center and them working with CFANs around fire knowledge and how tribes use fire as a resource, right? That was knowledge that was willing to be shared. But at some point they may have said, you know, we're going to tell you this, but this is for managing this project. It's not for dissemination at this point, right? So you're going to want to have that. And then just so you know, the sweet spot for a lot of Indigenous folks is multidisciplinary research. We know that as academics, you have your specialty and your knowledge is so deep. What we have seen with researchers that come into what we call Indian country, that's a legal term, when they come into Indian country, tribes challenge them in terms of how they look at various things. And let me give you an example. The Monoman project at the University of Minnesota was, you know, a wild rice project, very much grounded in biology and the sciences. But tribes, when they've had these conversations about how to manage this project and steps, tribes are saying, this is a public health issue. Access to traditional foods is very much, you know, a public health issue with 50% of our people having diabetes. It's an economic issue because it's a part of our value ag in our communities. It's a resiliency factor for our youth because we know when they participate in traditional cultural activities that are really grounded in their tribal ways and not defined by the media and stuff like that, that's a resiliency factor for our youth. So we talk a lot about like historical trauma and contemporary trauma, but we know that this is a resiliency factor for youth. And it all starts with wild rice. So see how holistic it gets fairly quickly with the way that tribes look at caretaking, you know, natural resources, that's caretaking relatives. Even the name natural resources, it's not a resource because that implies manipulation, extraction, use, accumulation. This is caretaking for relatives. Way different viewpoints that could affect the questions we ask as researchers and academics, right? And the disciplines that we bring to the table. The other part is internal. A part of this is internal. We have some fantastic Native and Indigenous faculty and researchers. Not enough, I would argue. That's something we should all work on within our departments because they, once again, they bring that value. But where you do have them, if you're tenured faculty, let them be, you know, a primary author. We know that Indigenous scholars within the academy have lots of stressors and barriers to tenure. Some of it is that they have to be representational on hiring committees and all of these other things. They're asked to provide mentorship to other scholars of color. And then when we wonder why their productivity and their publishing, you know, isn't at the same pace as a colleague that might not have some of those burdens, right? Not to mention as individuals, we're just kind of different, right? You know, generally non-traditional learners, non-traditional career paths, multi-generational household, community responsibilities. Our spirituality just isn't on Sunday, it's seasonal and in depth, you know, so just differing ways of being in the world that impact what we expect from solely Western-based value systems that end up being embedded in our systems. I'm going to say it again. You engage prior to that grant application. Think about a tribal advisory board. Ask the tribe who's appropriate to be on it, or multiple community members from multiple tribes, or if it's in an urban area, look at some of the Indigenous nonprofits and other leaders that are out there. I highly recommend where you have large equities with Native communities and tribes that you think about a tribal liaison within your college to build those relationships and manage them. One of the things that scares me the most around tribal engagement is that all of a sudden there's 6,000 researchers from the University of Minnesota all wanting a tribal advisory board and you know, putting things through an IRB because you know, we're trying to achieve that equity. But if you were doing it at a college level, you can have some logical groupings and consent processes and build those relationships. You could advise your staff internal. The Office of Native American Affairs, my office, it's me and one other person. So where we could build a capacity within the institution, that will really facilitate really good long-term relationships and stability for the tribes. And then I talked about Indigenous data sovereignty. I do want to show you, I'm going to take your questions in a second, okay? And can I, all right, I'm going to share one more thing. Bear with me as I manage the tag. Did I do it? Yeah. I don't know who hands out the gold stars, but if it's any of you, I deserve one for doing that with minimal tries. Okay, so here's what we are routing right now through. We've gone to faculty consultative committee. We have the chancellors have all seen this. The Council of Research Associate Deans, and we will be making our way to an event near you soon. So these are the guidelines for Indigenous researchers. They are written in plain language. Despite the fact that we are an institute of higher education, we wanted this document to be accessible to all levels of people who may be involved, whether this is a community-based advisory board, undergraduate researchers, up to our senior faculty who've been doing this a long time, but also the tribes themselves to understand what we are trying to hold ourselves accountable to, okay? So we talk about why we're doing it, which is what we talked about earlier. We give you very specific examples in this document. We also give you resources, just so you know, but we talk specifically about working with urban and off-reservation Indigenous communities and what that should look like, building the relationship with the tribe, how to do it. We talk a little bit about tribal IRBs. Some tribes have them, some don't. Now, and you might be saying to yourself, well, you know, they should get one. Well, they're running nations and they've only had the rights to self-govern since the 70s. They are running schools, police department, tribal courts, tribal colleges, language and culture programs, community centers, public works departments, enterprises. They have a lot on their plate and are still regularly underfunded. So tribes have a continuum of what they prioritize and what they have time to get to. What I tell folks is, number one, know that tribes sometimes have a broader definition of what should be brought before their IRB than we do. Western-based institutions, it's only human subjects. But when I talk about caretaking for relatives, and I talk about natural resources, many tribes want anything you do in their community to go before their IRB, even natural resources work or, you know, other disciplines as well. Here's the best practice, though, in addition to that is, what if they don't have an IRB? Our morals and our ethics in this institution, in order to reflect what we say are the University of Minnesota's values, you behave like that tribe has an IRB, whether it does or not. You go through that same process. Whoever it is they deem you should be talking to, you behave in the same way, present them the same information, and get that consent. That's where your value add back to the tribe and building their own capacity, because you are showing them what they could expect from a research that is there to behave in good faith and in good relation with them. Okay. And lots of footnotes, because we know we like our footnotes, because people like to go back to the source documents. And then we just give you like a checklist. What are you there for? Is it good for you? Or are you trying to be value add to the community? Are you ready to be there? What's the tribal capacity? If they want have a tribal need, and you're helping them fill it, put something in the grant to help them have the capacity to be your partner. And many times they're doing the work on the ground, barely funded. We are asking them for their time and labor away from other things that are tribal priorities. So see where you can put things in there, whether it's honoraria or a quarter time position, whatever. Have that conversation about what would be appropriate. Are you having community partners at the table? It's absolutely appropriate to have honoraria for those folks who are sharing their knowledge and time with you. Many times they're getting childcare or having to make other arrangements. So reduce that burden to participation. Make your introductions, be patient and flexible. Timelines generally are doing. There is nothing in the world that says that tribes have to adhere to it. That's why you build the relationship first. Your deadlines are more likely to be followed if they're organic and a part of a shared interest and not something that's being driven by our end. That's kind of imposing institutional racism, right? You're trying to drive the bus based on your needs, and you need to just kind of reject, some of that, what we consider normal, but is not in good relationship. This is the most important one. Accept no. That free, prior, and informed consent. If a tribe says not now or not ever on that subject matter, you have to respect that. To do otherwise would be to say that this university or your interest or your department is more important than the consent of the people you are doing it to. You're hearkening us back to another era. You're diminishing the ability for tribes to have their own self-government and self-determination. You are undervaluing their own agency and decision-making about their community. It's institutional racism, and we're not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to keep going through it. I talk about data sovereignty, but you will see this, and then we have a ton of resources at the end for additional learning, so that we continue to grow as individuals within this institution and in our capacity. While this might be official policy, I think we're a learning and growing institution. We're going to continue to look at this document over time and look at updating it periodically with the best practices that we will continue to develop with our community engaged research. And so with that, I'm going to quit talking at you, and Vince is going to help me take your questions.
Thank you, Karen. I loved how you ended that with this. That's institutional racism, and we're not going to have that here.
That might have been a lot of. So I got a sweatshirt for Christmas from my family, and it has Big Auntie Energy written on it with Ojibwe flowers all over it. So I think I might have brought you a little bit of Big Auntie Energy.
That's awesome. I think that I had mentioned that doing work in a good way and in good relations is actually a really, really good way to do research anyway, in any topic. And I've always felt that the aunties is a tougher panel than any panel or peer review process that I've ever dealt with. So
you get through the aunties, you're good to go.
Yeah, in my case, the aunties, and I have 6 older sisters. So let's go ahead and open this up. I'm going to do the best I can to work through 4 Brady Bunch screens and find the hands that go up, and at the same time try to take a look at questions and comments that are being added to the chat. So
And we have one of them. Meg, I am not a PhD. I am a a bureaucrat. I'm an administrator. So practical advice on working directly with tribal leadership, but through a mediator, a tribal wildlife biologist. If you have somebody working between you and the tribal council, many times that's because the tribal council is managing their time and delegating to staff. So you're going to want the tribal staff to help you and guide your questions up and facilitate that process. There are very few times you're actually going to meet with tribal council, and when you do, they're doing consultation, getting their questions answered. From that, they're going to direct their staff on what they can and can't do. But whoever your main tribal contact is, if it's a tribal wildlife biologist, let them manage that conversation up their own chain of command.
Karen, there's a question from Linda Frizzell to everyone, but it looks like it's addressed to you. Bourgeois, Chairwoman, could you share about the land grant process, Miigwech?
Yeah, so Dr. Frizzell is talking about, there was just this really seminal piece of journalism that came out a few years ago that talked about land grant institutions and the Moral Act, of which the University of Minnesota is one of them. The University of Minnesota's original corpus for its foundation came from a land grant as a territorial university. And then we found out like they mismanaged it, the original regents. And then it became a state, and it became the University of Minnesota, and it got a second land grant. And these were all from Indigenous lands that were given to it by the federal government, and continue to benefit it in many ways, the Permanent University Fund. Within a couple weeks, we're going to have a report coming out that was done by tribes, facilitated by the university, and it's called the Truth Project. And the Truth Project really talks about the history between the tribes that are here now, the tribes that used to be here, that were removed, and their history with the University of Minnesota. And the land grant is one piece of it. The original regents, is my understanding, specifically targeted really sacred and important sites to the Dakota to put our campus on, to give them a reason to remove them. So it wasn't just bad enough that they got the land and the value for it. They were methodical in taking homelands and sacred places. So the Truth Report is going to talk about that and many more things. And it's going to be a little bit hard for some folks to hear that we haven't behaved very well towards Indigenous peoples and tribes throughout our history. But it's the beginning of letting people say what they need to say, because that's where you find healing. And hopefully it'll be the place where we continue to acknowledge, just kind of that role this institution has played. And it starts setting a path for conversations with tribes about, how can we do better moving forward? So that will be out in a couple of weeks. You're going to want to look at it. It's really informative in terms of our own institution's history.
Let me point out that when that report comes out, everybody, surely there will be a reference to a major research project that helped prompt that report, and really shook things up for a while, and it's still ongoing. But this land grab university project, and a couple of articles that came out of that made specific the connection between federal and what later became state policy around making lands and resources available for what's become most of the big R1 universities, and what made those available was the taking of Indigenous lands and removal and of Indigenous peoples. That was not just a historical one-time event. The the vestiges of that policy and practice continues to the extent that states and state institutions also invested the resources from the land through purchases and mining and other forms of extraction that continues to this day. One of the things that was really eye-opening for a lot of us was how a lot of Dakota land ended up as property owned by other states and other universities as well. So it's not just the University of Minnesota, but also across the nation. I'm going to go back to the chat room. There's a question from Lisa Aguilar. Where can we find the document you were guiding us through? That's the guide book that
I'm gonna put my email in here because right now they're working on a web page for me. And right now I'm giving it out to the groups that I'm meeting with, but I don't have a way to make it public. So you can just email me and I'll shoot you a copy. I would like to reply to Dr. Bean. Hi, Dr. Bean. She was talking about the guidebook practices to engage scholars for tribes that no longer have territory, such as exiled Dakota. Meg further added, question for tribes that no longer have land access but maintain some governance. We would call that ceded territory, for example, over hunting. And the question to that is yes. The guidebook talks about traditional territories and where there are what we call usufructuary rights. Ceded territories are much larger land bases where tribes have original homelands or continue to have rights, which mean they have equities there, both legal equities and moral equities there. That is harder for us to understand as an institution because we understand quite clearly that going within reservation homelands means we need to interact with the tribal government. But what about tribes who have a larger land base where they hunt, fish, and gather, and we are doing research on those things, what should be considered items of cultural patrimony, like wolves, for example, wild rice, things like that. We recommend tribal consultation on those items as well, partly because we have something to learn from that as an institution and as researchers, and we do talk about that in the guidebook. And then I also wanted to touch bases on, is there a set of best practices created for teaching with Indigenous worldviews and forms of knowledge? No, not yet. I'm going to need help with something like that because I am not an academic. Best case scenario, we have Indigenous faculty who can do that because it is from their own scholarship and worldview. But I am going to challenge everybody on this call who has teaching responsibilities. One of the problems with attracting and retraining Native learners is they don't see themselves in our pedagogy. And so whether you are an Indigenous faculty member or not, it is pretty easy for you to include something in every class that represents those Indigenous worldviews. In some cases, it's, do you have a data table where it's Black, white, Asian, other, and you don't take the data table to that next one to have Indigenous folks in it? Take that extra step so that they're represented. At another institution, people said, well, I'm an astronomer. I couldn't possibly include anything Indigenous as mine. And I literally Googled in front of them, Native Americans in astronomy. And I was like, hey, look, we were circumnavigating the globe and had sophisticated trade networks while your guy was still getting lost. They're like, but I'm a psychologist. Native Americans in psychology. Who knew? There's a Native American Psychologists Association. So I challenge you as teaching staff to have one case study, one journal article, one mainstream media publication that relates to the field, something, at least one thing in every single class so that Indigenous learners, when they come to your class, don't feel invisible.
Thank you, Karen. I wanted to make a quick comment, but before that, invite everybody to look at the chat down towards the bottom. Sean Dorr and Ann Garagiola, graduate students, Ojibwe Anishinaabe graduate students, posted links to the High Country News Land Grab Universities article that I had referenced, and then the Truth Project link to the site there. And Dan Keefe posts a link to Indigenous Mathematicians Organization. So I assure you, echoing what Karen said,
I was a founder of Native Economists as a part of the National Economics Group. You know, talk about a little esoteric, but have some people doing good stuff.
yeah. So the question about the use of Indigenous knowledge, TEK, worldviews, that kind of stuff, it's a very tricky one. And even among Indigenous researchers and scholars, both inside and outside academia, there isn't a consensus around that. There are a lot of people who feel like that should be kept as far away as possible from academia because of the mistrust and suspicion and history. There's also people who feel quite strongly that if you want to do research properly, you have to follow original instructions and values and everything in between them. The question of that, when considering that, uppermost in your mind is the question of appropriation, inappropriate taking, and we see that, and unfortunately we've also seen practices like that go under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's supposed to be meant to do things differently, appropriating practices from Indigenous communities and branding them and copywriting them in proprietary ways. So that's a very tricky one. There isn't a consensus to it, and it can get very, very, very hairy very quickly. So
you know, it's the folks who are working on data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty, as well as those kind of working in the Indigenous human rights spaces internationally, are actually looking at traditional knowledge and how to protect it from legally acquiring it, you know, through copyright or anything like that, to help Indigenous peoples kind of protect it from these Western-based systems where the commercial value always seems to be much more important to some of these institutions than others, right? And so once again, I'm just kind of going to go back to that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and say, just read it. It talks about what are the kind of guideposts in dealing with Indigenous communities and kind of the guardrails in terms of how we kind of check ourselves as Western-based institutions. Do you have other questions? We're getting short. I could probably take one or two more.
I'm still looking at both the chat and the screen to see if any hands are coming up. I'm not seeing it. If anybody sees something, let me know.
Well, I'm not going to keep them hostage, Vince. Can I thank you all? You showed up today. And it really kind of, I think, challenges us as an institution because it changes how we think about our place in relation to others, especially tribal communities and those with different governing systems and cultural values and spiritual values. And it takes some kind of personal humility and curiosity to really say, you know, what is my place in this relationship, and how do I do it with that trustworthiness we started out with, and how do we do it with ethics? How do we do it with consent? And you know, we struggle as an institution of how do we attract and retain students? How do we attract and retain faculty and staff? How do we meet the needs of tribal communities as contemporary governments and, you know, as economic drivers in rural Minnesota? So the better we can get at all of this, to be in those good relations and act with those values, means the value we bring back to people in this state, as well as our learners that are coming here, we're going to be better for it. And the fact that you showed up and took some time to be curious, I am eternally grateful, and looking forward to getting those emails and sending you the Indigenous research guidelines. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, let me ask everybody to join me in thanking Karen Diver for this presentation. Some of you missed a link early on. Practically everything that Karen shared is embodied in a particular case of a success story with one of our own researchers at the University of Minnesota, Professor Crystal Ng at the Earth Sciences. And there, at the very top of the chat, there's a link to a very recent article from the Food and Environment Reporting Network. The article is titled "The Future of Wild Rice May Depend on an Unlikely Alliance." Karen Ng is a hydrologist and had to really rethink and transform how she does research to work with the article.
Crystal.
Crystal, sorry.
Yeah.
The article really does a wonderful job fleshing that out. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And it struck me at how so much of that story encapsulates many of the points that Karen made. So,
well, so funnily enough, that was right after I got back from the Obama administration, and they were doing some research and talking to Fond du Lac, and they were like, you know, we could use some help, kind of do's and don'ts. And I was like, you need training. I trained them all, and then really started working on that relationality. So Lane mentioned it, Lane Johnson, it was like, I was like their project auntie, and they were a Grand Challenges grantee. And then once they formed that relationship, it just became really organic, and how they interacted on an ongoing basis with tribal knowledge holders and tribal leaders, their governing structure, their decision-making processes, the respect for tribal sovereignty. And it really is an example of the University of Minnesota doing it right. And when you hear from those researchers that it fundamentally changed how they look at their own discipline in relation to others, and how they do their work, this is the value of doing it the right way. You will be a better researcher and have better outcomes because of it.
thank you.
Well, I just want to express my sincere thanks also to Professor Diaz and Senior Consultant Karen Diver, both of you just sharing your perspective. I think we all are humbled and grateful for all of your wisdom. And we are, I think, much more well-equipped after sitting here today. So we look forward to continuing conversations this week during Research Week. We encourage you all. Tomorrow is Research Ethics Day. There is a number of really wonderful presentations. But again, thank you all for attending. Thank you for your time today.